The folding chair still sits outside, right where they left it, its legs rusted, fabric torn, slouched against the cold siding like something forgotten on purpose. They told me there wasn't room this year, said the table was full, the house too tight, the plans already made. I didn't argue. I just stood there holding my pie, watching that chair. The one they used to offer when they still remembered I belonged. That day I didn't just lose my seat. I lost the last thread of belonging. I live in a quiet cul-de-sac, where wind chimes speak more often than the neighbors. My home, small, single-story, painted soft blue with white trim, sits like an old photograph at the end of the street. It's the same house where I raised my 3 children, where I kissed my husband good morning for 42 years, where every Thanksgiving used to smell like cinnamon, sage, and laughter. Now it mostly smells like lemon polish and quiet. I'm 78 this year. My knees don't let me garden like I used to, but I still keep the porch clean and the mailbox oiled. Routine is a friend that never forgets to show up. Mornings are for oatmeal and birdsong, afternoons for crossword puzzles and a cup of tea. Always in the green cup with the chipped rim. That chip reminds me of the time my grandson, Caleb, accidentally knocked it off the counter when he was 3. I had laughed and kissed his forehead. That was years ago. He's 15 now, taller than me with a voice that doesn't squeak anymore. They used to visit. All of them. Sundays were noisy. Toys scattered across the living room, grandkids racing through the hallway, and my daughters-in-law helping me stir the gravy while we gossiped about nothing important. My son would sit in his father's old recliner, pretending not to listen. My daughter, always fashionably late, would sweep in with store-bought desserts and a sigh that meant she'd been rushing. And me, I was the center. The cook, the storyteller, the keeper of band-aids and secrets. It didn't change overnight. I want to be fair about that. It was a slow unraveling, like a sweater snagged on a nail. A little tug here, a little thread there. First it was the phone calls. They got shorter. I'd ask questions, and the answers would come in half-smiles I couldn't hear through the receiver. Then it was the visits. "We're just so busy, Mom," they'd say. "The kids have so many activities." I understood. I always did. That's how I raised them. To work hard, be involved, strive for more. I just didn't think more would mean less of me. The last full Thanksgiving we had together, I remember the turkey turned out too dry. Everyone was polite about it, but I noticed how much cranberry sauce they used, as if trying to make it easier to swallow. My daughter-in-law had brought her own stuffing. "Just in case," she said with a laugh. I pretended not to mind. I even complimented it. That same evening, as I cleared the table, I overheard my oldest whisper to his wife in the hallway. "She's getting tired. Maybe next year we take over." I stood very still behind the kitchen door, holding a stack of plates. They weren't cruel words, just definitive. Like a decision had been made and I'd missed the vote. I remember looking down at the plates in my hands, the same ones I bought with S&H green stamps in 1972. They've served every family meal since. I once believed their little floral pattern had absorbed every laugh, every argument, every second helping of mashed potatoes. But that night they just felt heavy. The following months were filled with little signs. Recipes I sent weren't used. My daughter posted pictures of a birthday party I wasn't invited to. "Just the cousins," she said when I asked, as if I hadn't once rocked those same cousins to sleep. I stopped baking my cinnamon rolls. Nobody asked for them anymore. I started talking more to the television than to people. Game shows don't interrupt or look at their phones while you speak. Even the house seemed to notice. The front room, once so warm, started feeling like a waiting area. The couch sat too straight, the photo frames too still. My husband's chair, the one no one would sit in out of respect, stayed untouched, covered in a fine, steady dust. I dusted it once, then left it be. Felt like even he had stopped listening. Still I tried. I made my famous apple pie for Easter, wrapped it in a towel and took the bus to my son's house. They weren't expecting me. I could tell by how long it took them to answer the door. My granddaughter hugged me politely but didn't let go of her phone. I sat in the corner while everyone talked over each other, and when dessert came out, my pie was still in the kitchen, untouched. No one meant harm. That's the part that stings the most. It would be easier if they had been cruel, but they were just indifferent. Like I was a soft shadow in the room, taking up space they barely noticed. I began to shrink quietly, invisibly. Not in size but in presence. I stopped offering help, stopped asking questions. When I did speak, it was only when I was spoken to. I became polite, neat, predictable. They seemed to like me better that way. One day, I found myself rearranging the dining chairs, trying to see how many people could fit if they all came at once. I stood there with the tape measure in hand, realizing how long it had been since anyone had actually sat at that table. The chairs creaked from loneliness. I sat down, right in the middle of the table, and looked around at the empty room. Then, like dust settling in sunlight, it came to me. I had raised children who had learned how to move forward. I just hadn't taught them how to bring me with them. And maybe, just maybe, that had been my mistake. But some mistakes don't mean you stop being the one who built the house. Some mistakes just mean it's time to pick up the hammer again. The small things always come first, the kinds of things you almost forgive without realizing. Like the time my son dropped off a grocery bag on my porch without ringing the bell. Just texted, "Left you some things." I opened the door and watched his car reverse down the driveway. He waved from behind the glass but didn't get out. Inside the bag were low-sodium crackers, prune juice, and a single apple. No note. No pie crust, no tea we used to share. Just the kinds of things someone might give to someone they pity. Or the time my daughter brought her youngest over, and I overheard her whisper to him, "Don't ask Grandma too many questions, she forgets things now." I heard it clearly. I hadn't forgotten a thing. And yet I said nothing. They weren't trying to be unkind. I believe that even now. But kindness isn't just what you do, it's what you see, and they had stopped seeing me. Soon conversations became one-sided. They told me about their busy schedules, about what they were renovating, what new sport the kids had joined. I listened, nodded, smiled. But no one asked me what book I was reading, what dreams I still had, or what I did on Tuesday afternoons. It's strange to still be living but treated like you've already stopped. The humiliations weren't loud. They didn't come with slammed doors or harsh words. They came softly, wrapped in forgetfulness. My birthday forgotten 1 year. Then Mother's Day. Not even a card, just a "hope you're doing well" text from my daughter-in-law the next morning. Once my grandson Caleb, the one who chipped the green teacup, came by with his father. I offered him the cookies I had baked that morning, his favorite kind. He smiled shyly, then looked at his dad. "I'm okay," he said. My son smiled and patted my shoulder. "He's on a health kick now, Ma." So I put the cookies back in the tin, sealed it quietly, and placed it in the cupboard. That evening I ate 4 of them myself, slowly, with milk. The sweetness didn't reach very far. It was in these moments, not loud but cutting, that I began to feel the sharp edge of being unnecessary. I tried to brush it off. Told myself families get busy. Told myself to be grateful for the times they did show up. But the house began to sound more and more like an apology waiting to be written. Even the photo frames turned away, collecting dust. I stopped printing new pictures. The last one I had framed was from a Thanksgiving 5 years ago. Everyone crowded around the table, my husband's old flannel shirt visible in the background, me holding the turkey with both hands like it was still my job to carry something heavy for them. But the table was different now. Last fall, they invited me to dinner at my son's house. Or so I thought. When I arrived, a bit early as I always do, I found my daughter-in-law setting up. Her expression flickered when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "We thought maybe you weren't coming. We had told you it was next week." My son walked in, quiet behind her. "You must have mixed up the date, Ma." But I hadn't. I checked the message when I got home. It had clearly said that evening. I didn't call to correct them. Didn't mention it again. But I sat for a long time on the edge of my bed that night, purse still on my lap, shoes still on my feet. And I thought, if I were a stranger, they might treat me with more care. The final small thing came one Tuesday morning, when I called my daughter just to hear her voice. She answered, but I could tell she was distracted. After 2 minutes, she said, "Sorry, Mom, I've got to run. I'll call you back later." She never did. I waited 3 days, then deleted the voicemail I had left her. Just a soft, "Hey honey, just checking in." By now, I had learned something important. Silence from loved ones doesn't echo. It settles. And slowly, gently, it changes the shape of you. I stopped knitting that week. The scarf I had started for my grandson's birthday stayed curled like a question in my basket. I stopped looking at the mail before noon. I stopped making extra when I cooked. And I stopped telling them I missed them, because I could see it in their eyes, the way their gazes slid past me like I was a fixture, not a person. I wasn't part of the table anymore. I was the wallpaper, the background, a shadow sitting in a room that had grown too loud for its own silence. And yet, even in all that, I didn't yell, didn't confront. I just listened, watched, held it all like an unopened letter in my chest. It would take one more moment, one quiet, heavy moment to finally split me open. But even now, even then, a part of me was beginning to see it. I was still here, still breathing, still standing. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't the only ones who could make a seat at the table. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The weather had turned, the kind of wind that taps against your windows like it's checking if you're still alive inside. I had just finished putting away the groceries, simple things. Carrots, potatoes, cream for the pie I still thought I might bake. Not because they asked, no one had, but because it was tradition. Because for 47 years I had made the same pie. I was folding the paper bag when my phone buzzed. It was a group text. All 3 of my children. Hey guys. Just confirming for tomorrow 2 p.m. at Kevin's. Small gathering. Just us and the kids this year. Hope that works for everyone. Just us. I read it 3 times, the phrase catching like a burr beneath my ribs. Just us. I wasn't us. Not anymore. My thumb hovered above the screen. I could reply. Say, I think you sent this to me by mistake. Or, what should I bring? Pretend I didn't understand. Pretend they didn't mean to leave me out. But I didn't type anything. Instead, I sat down in the kitchen chair, the same one I'd painted yellow in 1985 when everything needed cheering up. I looked around at the quiet kitchen, counter still clean, oven cold, pie plate untouched in the cabinet. The silence didn't feel gentle. It felt final. No invitation. No explanation. Just us. That evening, I laid out the old tablecloth anyway. The red one with frayed corners. I roasted a small chicken, not a turkey, not this year, and made a single slice of pie. I put the pie in my best dish and set the table for one. Not out of denial, no, not anymore, but out of habit. Out of love, maybe. Or muscle memory. Something in me refused to sit in darkness. I poured the cider into a crystal glass and sat quietly as the wind moaned against the door. I cut into the chicken, ate 2 bites, set my fork down. There is a silence that comes when you are truly alone, and it does not beg for noise. It asks for witness. So I witnessed myself, sitting at the head of a table no one would join. Not forgotten, chosen against. That night I didn't cry. Not like I had other times. There were no sobs, no heaving. Just a slow unraveling, like someone inside me was quietly packing up her things. I left the dishes in the sink, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out a box I hadn't touched in years. It was my husband's box, the one he kept tucked behind the winter coats. Inside were old papers, documents, hand-drawn plans for the house he'd once dreamed of building for us in Vermont. And right at the bottom, under a yellowed envelope, was the deed to our home. Still in both our names. Still mine. I sat on the floor with that paper in my lap and let the silence deepen. This house, this life was not a favor from anyone. I had made every curtain in this place, repaired every loose button, clipped every coupon, read every report card. I had stayed up during fevers, held hands during surgeries, prayed in parking lots for good news. I had earned every floorboard, every light switch, every holiday memory they now shared without me. And I suddenly knew deep in my chest that I had been mistaken all these years. I hadn't lost my place. They had walked away from it. They had pulled their chairs to another table and left mine empty. And still, I had been the one to keep feeding them in silence. But now, sitting with the deed in my hand and no one knocking on my door, not even to bring leftovers, I understood something I hadn't dared say out loud before. I was done waiting. Not bitter. Not angry. Just done. Done hoping for invitations from people who had stopped seeing me. Done offering warmth where none was returned. Done folding myself to fit in the corner of their lives like an afterthought. I stood up slowly, the deed pressed against my chest like a shield. And I said aloud, to no one in particular, maybe to the wind, maybe to God, "This is still my house." It was a small sentence, but it rang louder than any family gathering I had ever attended. That night I slept without setting the alarm. The pie cooled untouched in the fridge, and I didn't open my phone in the morning. There were no new messages. No apologies. Just silence. And yet, for the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. Felt like space. Like a doorway. Like the start of something that belonged to me. Not borrowed. Not begged for. Mine. The morning after Thanksgiving, the air was cold enough to sting. The sky hung low and gray, like a blanket that had lost its warmth. I opened the back door, stepped outside with a cup of lukewarm coffee, and just stood there, letting the chill settle into my bones. The folding chair was still out there, the same one they used to set up for me when there wasn't quite enough room at the table. Its seat sagged under the weight of nothing. I looked at it for a long time. Then I walked over, picked it up with both hands and quietly set it by the curb. No ceremony. No anger. Just release. I went back inside, found a blank notepad in the kitchen drawer, one I used to write grocery lists, and began a different kind of list. Things I own. Things I love. Things I no longer need to carry. At the top, in small steady letters, I wrote, "This house is mine." It may sound silly to some, but it mattered. I needed to see it in ink. That afternoon, I walked through every room of the house. Not to clean, not to straighten, but to notice. I touched the edge of my husband's desk, still nicked from the time our youngest scraped his science fair board across it. I opened the linen closet and ran my hands over the towels, the blue ones we got on sale our first year married, still holding shape after decades. I knelt by the bookshelf and pulled out the old photo albums. Not to cry, just to remember. These were my things. My memories. My life. And I didn't need to explain their worth to anyone. I found myself moving things around not out of necessity but out of care. I took the guest plates, the ones no one used anymore, and placed them in the center cabinet. For me. I deserved nice plates even if I was eating alone. I changed the sheets on my bed, not because anyone was coming over, but because I wanted crisp corners and lavender-scented linen. I took the cookies I had hidden away weeks ago and left them in a jar on the counter. If no one else would enjoy them, I would. That evening, as the house glowed golden under the soft hum of lamplight, I opened my bottom dresser drawer. Inside was a small envelope, yellowed at the edges. It was a letter I had written to myself on my 60th birthday, a little tradition I had started quietly, without telling anyone. Each decade I would write myself a note, seal it and tuck it away. The letter read simply, "I hope you still laugh. I hope you still wear your favorite earrings, even if you're not going anywhere. I hope you don't let them tell you you're too much or too little. You have always known how to make a house into a home. Never forget. You are still becoming." I read that line again. You are still becoming. At 78, I thought my becoming had ended. That the only thing left was the waiting for visits, for holidays, for someone to remember to include me. But maybe, just maybe, becoming never ends. Maybe it just changes its shape. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat down and made a plan. Nothing grand. No schemes, no revenge. Just a quiet reclaiming. The next morning, I walked into the bank and updated the beneficiary on my account. Not to punish anyone, but to choose someone who had made me feel seen. My friend June from the church knitting circle, who always brought me an extra scone on Sundays. I smiled thinking about her surprise one day, long from now, when she'd open a letter and find what I had quietly left behind. Then I called a man named Ellis. A lawyer. One of my former students. He used to sit in the front row, all elbows and questions, asking about things far beyond the test. Now he was grown, successful, respectful, and when he heard my voice he said, "Mrs. Holloway? I'd do anything for you." We met for coffee that afternoon. I told him I wanted to go over the house deed, my will, and a few other papers I hadn't looked at in a while. "I'm not dying," I said gently. "I'm just ready to live on my own terms." He smiled like he understood. Because he did. That evening I came home and cooked a simple dinner. Salmon, roasted potatoes, and green beans with lemon. I ate it on the good china, lit a candle and played old jazz records in the background. No occasion. Just breath. Just presence. Just me. The air felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but more honest. There's a kind of power that doesn't shout. It lives in measured steps, handwritten notes, a well-folded blanket, and the quiet movement of someone deciding she is enough. They hadn't taken my place at the table. They had only reminded me to build one of my own. The first thing I did that morning was open every curtain in the house. Not just the ones in the living room, but even the dusty ones in the hallway, the sheer ones in the laundry room, the heavy ones in the bedroom I hadn't used since my husband passed. Let the light in, I thought. Let it find the corners that haven't been looked at in years. There was no dramatic music. No marching drumbeat inside me. Just soft steps. But every movement felt rooted. Like I was finally walking toward something that had waited too long. The day before, Ellis had sent me the first draft of the new documents. I made a cup of tea and read every page at the kitchen table, under the hum of the little overhead light that had flickered for years, and never once gotten fixed. That flickering bulb. It had become part of the background, like so many other things I had learned to live with. Forgotten birthdays, quiet holidays, whispered assumptions that I was old and fragile. I got up and changed the bulb. Small things, but they added up. That same afternoon I went to the attic. The old wooden ladder creaked under my steps, but I climbed it anyway. There were boxes up there I hadn't touched since my children left home. One was labeled Kevin College Stuff. Another said Photos 1980s. But the one I wanted sat at the very back, hidden under a plastic Christmas wreath and a box of tangled string lights. It was labeled simply, House. Inside were papers from the original purchase, faded copies, notes in my husband's handwriting, even some fabric samples we never used for the guest room. And there, right at the bottom, was the envelope I'd been looking for. The second deed. The first time we refinanced, we added my name. But years later, during some financial trouble, it had been rewritten again, only in his name. I'd forgotten, or maybe I never really asked. Back then I trusted too easily. Trusted that I'd always belong in what I helped build. But Ellis had caught it. Technically, he said gently, this house is still under your husband's estate, but you're the legal heir. We can correct it. We should. I had nodded, not because I wanted to fight, but because I was tired of fading into the background of my own home. The next step came quietly. I canceled the automatic bank transfer I had been sending to my son each month. It wasn't a large amount, just a few $100s I had offered when they were struggling with a second mortgage and 2 kids in daycare. That was 7 years ago. They never asked me to stop. Maybe they forgot it was even coming from me. When the bank clerk asked, "Do you want to notify the recipient?" I smiled softly. "No, thank you. I believe they'll notice eventually." That weekend I donated 3 bags of clothes, not because they didn't fit, but because they no longer felt like mine. There were outfits I had worn to play the part. The helpful grandmother, the reliable mother, the invisible matriarch who never made demands. Soft grays, muted browns, floral prints I never loved. I replaced them with a few things I picked out myself, jewel tones, bold embroidery, even a cardigan with tiny birds stitched along the collar. I wore it the next day when I walked to the post office, and 2 strangers complimented me before I'd crossed the street. Small affirmations, but they felt like handrails on a staircase I didn't know I was climbing. On Sunday I sat down to write a letter. Not to my children, not yet, but to myself. A letter of recognition. I wrote, "You were never a guest in this life. You were the builder, the keeper, the warmth. You don't have to beg for a seat when you built the floor beneath it. You are not forgotten. You are simply free." I folded it, placed it in the drawer where I kept my favorite tea bags, and smiled. That night, I did something I hadn't done since my husband died. I lit the fireplace. It crackled hesitantly at first, as if unsure whether it was still allowed to bring comfort. But then the flames caught, and the room softened. I wrapped myself in the blue blanket I had crocheted last winter, the one no one asked about, and sat on the couch with a photo album. Not to reminisce, not to ache, but to see clearly. Page after page I watched my younger self laugh, cook, hold babies, mend hems, shovel snow, rock crying children. I watched her set tables with mismatched napkins and perfect timing. I watched her build a life that didn't ask for much but gave everything. And I whispered to her without shame or sadness, "They may not remember what you gave, but you do. And that's enough." The next morning I signed the updated deed. The house was now mine. Fully, legally, entirely. Not to keep others out, but to keep myself in. To stay standing in something I had built, not borrowed. Later that week, I wrote a short note to each of my children. Nothing sharp. Nothing heavy. Just a sentence or two. I've been taking some time to reorganize things. Just thought I'd let you know the house is now in my name alone. Hope you're well. I didn't wait for replies. That wasn't the point anymore. This wasn't about cutting them off. It was about stitching myself back together. Piece by quiet piece. It's strange what rises when you stop trying to silence yourself. Memories come back, not always invited. Like someone tapping softly at the back door, asking to be let in just for a minute. And once you open that door, the wind brings with it the dust of old days you thought you'd swept away for good. That week, the one after I signed the deed, I couldn't sleep. Not out of worry. Not even sadness. But because something deep inside me had started to stir. A voice I hadn't heard in years. My own. And that voice brought stories I hadn't told in decades. One night I stood at the sink washing a single plate after dinner. The warm water ran over my hands, and without thinking I whispered, "You always went quiet, didn't you?" I didn't mean it as a question. I meant it as a truth. The first time I was ever silenced I was 19. It was my wedding day. I stood in my mother-in-law's kitchen, holding a plate of deviled eggs I had stayed up late preparing the night before. She looked at them, frowned and said, "We don't need those. My sister brought hers, they're better." She took the plate from my hands and placed it in the fridge without another word. I stood there, still in my apron, nodding like I understood. Like I agreed. That moment should have been small. But it lived inside me like a splinter. That night, when everyone danced and drank and toasted, I smiled and nodded and kissed cheeks. But something inside had already bent. A little piece of me had learned not to offer what wasn't asked for, even if it came from love. Years later, after our second child was born, my husband got a promotion. We celebrated over dinner. The four of us packed into a booth, me holding the baby, him beaming. I remember reaching for his hand under the table and saying, "You've worked so hard. I'm so proud of you." And he said, not cruelly but flatly, "Well, someone had to do the hard work." He didn't mean it to wound, but it did. Because I had been waking up every night, feeding that baby, scrubbing diapers by hand, rationing canned peaches so the children would have something sweet in their lunchboxes. But none of it counted. Not in the ways that got promotions. I stopped reaching for his hand after that. Another silence. Another fold in the paper. And then years later, when my daughter came home crying because another girl at school had said something cruel, I held her close. Told her, "You're not too much. You're just enough." But when I cried in that same kitchen years later, the night I found a lump in my breast, I did it alone in the bathroom with a towel shoved in my mouth so no one would hear. Because I didn't want to be too much. Because I had taught myself that my fear was something to carry quietly. Thankfully, the lump was benign. But the silence, that remained. And in all these moments, in all these rooms, through birthdays and burnouts and quiet hurts, I never screamed. Never slammed a door. Never even said, "That hurt." I just got quieter. More agreeable. More background. Until one day, I couldn't hear myself think over the noise of their assumptions. Assumptions that I was fine with being forgotten. Assumptions that I didn't need to be asked how I was doing. Assumptions that I was soft because I never raised my voice. But silence doesn't mean peace. It only means practice. And I had practiced disappearing for most of my life. That's why, when they left me off the guest list, it wasn't the first betrayal. It was just the first one I decided to see with both eyes open. I remembered another moment. A small buried one. Our oldest son's high school graduation. I had sewn a dress just for the occasion. Light blue with a little belt matched my eyes. When we arrived, my husband told me to go save seats while he parked the car. I sat alone holding 3 programs in my lap, waiting and waiting. But they never came to sit beside me. He had run into a colleague and ended up on the other side of the stadium with his arm around our son's shoulder, laughing, already posing for pictures. I didn't interrupt. Didn't wave. Just sat there with the extra programs, smiling at nothing. Later, when I asked, "Why didn't you come find me?" he said, "Oh, I didn't even see you there." He didn't mean to be cruel. But sometimes cruelty isn't what you do. It's what you forget to undo. And now, years later, it's not the exclusion that hurt the most. It's how familiar it felt. Like a coat I had worn too long. But sitting there holding my teacup, With the fireplace flickering, the house finally quiet in a different way. I saw it clearly. I wasn't grieving just one moment. I was grieving a lifetime of agreeing to disappear. A lifetime of not taking up space. A lifetime of handing over the chair, the plate, the credit, the words. But no more. I was not just someone's wife or mother or grandmother. I was me. And I had been here all along. Breathing. Loving. Caring. Becoming. Not loud. Not angry. But awake. And from that place, that remembering, I took one small breath. And exhaled 60 years of silence. It was early spring when I found the photos. I hadn't gone looking for them. No, I had simply opened my computer to order more yarn. The lavender one I like had gone on sale, and I thought I'd treat myself. I hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary. Just a simple morning. But then I clicked open the browser, and there it was, a photo posted by my daughter-in-law. Sunlight, smiles, sand. All of them, my children, their spouses, the grandchildren, lined up on a beach I knew by heart. I didn't need a caption to recognize it. That beach was ours. The same stretch of coast where we had taken family trips every summer for 2 decades. The same beach where I taught each of my grandchildren to look for shells, where I bandaged scraped knees, packed sandwiches, and read novels under the striped umbrella they now stood beside. In the photo, my youngest grandson was wearing my husband's old baseball cap, the one I had given to Kevin years ago for safekeeping. I hadn't seen it in a while. They were all smiling. Wide, sunlit, carefree. Except me. I wasn't in the photo. I hadn't been invited. No call. No mention. No offhand. "We're thinking of taking a trip, Mom. Want to join?" Nothing. They had gone without me. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The photo was posted a week ago. I clicked through a few more. One of the grandkids digging a hole. Another of my daughter holding a sparkler on the beach at night. A picture of a fire pit with someone roasting marshmallows. And then I saw it. Spread on the sand beneath the fire pit was a crocheted blanket. The blanket. The one I had made when my daughter was pregnant with her first child. Soft peach ivory trim, tiny rows of stars along the edge. I had worked on it for months, picking each color to match the nursery she'd once described in detail over the phone. I stared at it, the threads now dulled by sand, smoke, and footsteps. And there, right in the middle of it, sat their dog. Panting. Happy. Muddy paws. I closed the laptop gently. Not in anger. But because my hands had started to tremble. I sat very still in the kitchen, letting the room fill with the weight of what I now understood. It hadn't been a mistake. It wasn't about me being fragile or not wanting to travel, or them assuming I'd be too tired. They had planned it, bought the tickets, packed the bags, arranged the meals, and stood on that beach smiling, without ever even thinking to include me. And they had taken the things I made with love, the cap, the blanket, the memories, and repurposed them as background, as props. As if I had never really been part of it to begin with. There is a kind of grief that doesn't scream. It just sits beside you in the quiet and holds your hand. And as I sat there, hand on the old wooden table, heart somewhere between fury and numbness, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say until that very moment. I was not loved in the way I had loved them. It wasn't mutual. It wasn't even close. And it had never been. I had poured from a cup they didn't notice was emptying. I had shown up, year after year, with arms full of food and warmth and stories, and they had taken what they needed, then moved on. Not cruelly. Just conveniently. They had taken the chair from under me and smiled like nothing was missing. I think that was the moment the hurt changed shape. Before, I had been aching for their attention, longing for inclusion, hoping that maybe one day they'd remember who I was to them. But now I knew. They remembered. They just didn't think I mattered enough to miss. And that hurt in a different way. Cleaner way. Because with that hurt came a strange kind of freedom. I was no longer waiting. No longer hoping. No longer imagining a table set with my place waiting quietly. They had made their table. And they had left me off the guest list. The next morning I packed up every photo from those family beach trips. Not out of spite. Just clarity. I wrapped them in old newspaper, labeled the box passed, and slid it into the attic. I pulled the crocheted twin of that blanket, the one I had made for myself, off the shelf, shook it out and folded it gently on my bed. I opened my notebook and wrote. They did not forget. They chose. Then below it in smaller print. And I choose too. That evening, I deleted the bookmarks to their social media pages. I boiled a pot of water, made a bowl of tomato soup, and sliced a piece of sourdough toast. I ate it in silence, watching the sun disappear behind the curtains I had left open. There was no apology, no realization, no phone call, just the quiet sound of something inside me closing, and something else beginning to open. There is a silence that comes not from being shut out, but from choosing to shut the door gently behind you. That's what those days felt like after I saw the photos. Not rage, not heartbreak. Just the soft sound of walking away without slamming anything. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't make a scene. I simply removed myself from where I was no longer seen. The first thing I did was stop explaining myself. When my daughter texted 2 weeks later, "Mom, sorry I've been busy. Let's catch up soon." I didn't rush to reply. Not out of spite, but because I had learned that soon was a word people use to keep you on the hook without making room in their lives. I waited until the next morning and replied, "Hope things are going well." That was all. No "when are you free?" No open door. Just kindness with a period. I started practicing that kindness with a period. Not kindness with an asterisk. Not kindness with a door held half open, waiting to be let back in. Just clean, calm, steady lines. One morning I stood in front of the hallway mirror, the one with a crack running through the frame, and I said out loud, "You're not a burden." Felt strange at first. Like speaking to someone I hadn't properly met in years. But I kept doing it. "You're not invisible. You are still here. You don't need their permission to matter." I'd whisper it while brushing my hair, while tying my shoes, while stirring soup. Little spells to pull myself back into my own skin. I stopped making extra food. I started lighting candles just for me. I changed the voicemail on my phone. It used to say, "Leave a message and I'll call you right back." Now it simply said, "You've reached Marion. Please leave a message." 'Cause maybe I would call back. And maybe I wouldn't. That was my choice now. One of the biggest changes happened on a Wednesday. I had received an invitation in the mail from the local senior center. A weekly reading group was looking for volunteers to help children with their schoolwork. I held the flyer in my hand, reading it twice. It felt like a door. Not one that swung open with great fanfare, but one I could gently push if I wanted. So I did. That Friday I showed up, holding nothing but a pen and a folded paper with the address written in blue ink. They gave me a chair and a child named Mateo, who hated reading but loved dinosaurs. We sounded out words together, page by page. Every time he got one right, his eyes lit up like a small firework. At the end of the hour he handed me a crumpled sticker from his pocket, a little gold star, and whispered, "You're better than my teacher." I almost cried, but I just smiled and tucked the star inside my notebook. That night I went home and wrote, "I am still useful. I am still needed. Just not where I expected to be." There is something deeply healing about being seen by strangers, especially little ones who have no idea how many years you've gone without hearing your name said with wonder. Over the next few weeks I kept showing up. I walked to the market and picked out fruit just for me. I let go of clothes that no longer made me feel anything. I turned on music while I cooked, real music, not just background noise. And I danced. Once, right there in the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, toes tapping against the cold linoleum floor. I wasn't graceful, but I was alive. I let the quiet become something else. Not a punishment, but a place of rest. A place of remembering. There's power in silence when you choose it. There's dignity in absence when it's your own decision. I stopped justifying my boundaries. Stopped hoping they'd notice the space I left at their tables. Because the truth was, I no longer missed the noise. I missed myself. And slowly, day by day, she returned. The woman who hummed while she folded laundry. The woman who loved mystery novels and strong coffee. The woman who used to write poems in the margins of recipe books. She had been waiting. And now she was home. No fanfare. No grand declaration. Just presence. Just peace. And as I sat one evening, wrapped in my bird-stitched cardigan, a bowl of soup in my lap, I looked around the room and whispered, "I didn't disappear. I just paused." And now I had pressed play again. It was the second Tuesday in April when I found the letter. I wasn't looking for anything. I had simply reached into the drawer beside my bed for a pen, and there it was, tucked between a booklet on Medicare and an old envelope with no stamp. The handwriting was uneven, slanted, unmistakably young. My name written in green crayon across the front. Mrs. Holloway. I opened it gently, the folds crisp with age, and began to read. It was from a student I must have taught him in 3rd grade. His name was Marcus. I remembered him vaguely. Quiet, tall for his age, always with a notebook full of little drawings. He'd given me this letter on the last day of school, and somehow it had followed me through 3 decades, 2 homes, and the countless cleanouts of a mother's life. In bright green ink he had written, "Thank you for being the first person who ever said I was smart. I will never forget that. I hope when you're old people treat you nice, because you are the best adult I ever met." I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it slowly and pressed it to my chest. I had forgotten so many things, names, dates, where I left the second pair of reading glasses, but I hadn't forgotten how to be kind. And someone remembered. Someone always remembers. That evening, I took the letter to the living room and placed it in the center of the table, beside my candle and crossword. Not as decoration. As proof. Proof that I had mattered, not just as a mother or wife, but as me. I stayed quiet for a long time, just watching the paper flutter slightly each time the breeze passed through the cracked window. And in that quiet, something rose inside me. Not a thought, not a sentence, just a warm certainty. I am still here. I pulled out my notebook and began writing down moments. Not for anyone else, just for myself. Moments I had mattered. When I stayed up until 2 a.m. sewing my daughter's Halloween costume so she could be the sparkliest jellyfish. When I held my son after he failed his driving test and told him, "You are still going places." When my neighbor's mother passed and I brought soup every night for a week, because grief doesn't end with the first casserole. When I taught an entire generation of children how to find joy in commas and confidence in reading aloud. I filled 3 pages that night. Not achievements. Not awards. Just evidence. Of who I'd been. Of who I still was. And for the first time in a long time, I saw myself without needing someone else's reflection to feel real. A few days later I met someone new. Not a man, not a lover, I wasn't looking for that and frankly didn't need it. Her name was Elsie. She had soft gray hair like mine and wore bright red shoes, even though her knees didn't quite like them anymore. We met at the library. She was tutoring a little girl in math while I was helping Mateo with his spelling. We smiled across the table, like women who recognize something in one another. A tired kind of strength, a quiet kind of joy. After the session, she turned to me and said, "I like your sweater." I smiled. "Thank you. It has birds." She leaned in, eyes twinkling. I noticed. Only a woman with her own mind wears a cardigan like that. We had tea the next day at her house. Mismatched cups, banana bread slightly burnt on the edges, and a vase full of plastic flowers that had seen better years. It was perfect. She didn't ask about my family. I didn't ask about hers. We talked about books. About how tomatoes taste worse than they used to. About how silence isn't always loneliness. Sometimes it's the reward you get for surviving the noise. She reminded me of myself, not the version I had become, but the version I had hidden. Every Sunday after that we had tea. Sometimes we didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. Just sat, listening to the ticking clock, letting the stillness stretch around us like warm wool. One day she brought out an old record player. Played Nat King Cole. We sat on the porch and let the music fill the spaces we used to beg our children to occupy. And we smiled. I found a new rhythm with Elsie. It didn't replace anything. It just reminded me that life doesn't stop giving you people. You just have to be open enough to recognize them when they show up in unexpected shoes. Between the letter from Marcus and the Sundays with Elsie, I began to see my life differently. Not as something winding down, but as something still expanding. Like a quiet tide rolling in, unnoticed at first. Until suddenly your feet are wet and you realize the ocean hasn't forgotten you after all. One evening I sat down at my desk and wrote a new letter. To myself. Not the me of now, but the me I would be 10 years from now. I wrote, "I hope you're still lighting candles when you eat. I hope you still dance in the kitchen, even if only a little. I hope you're still writing things down because you forget more now, but you remember better than ever. And I truly hope, that you've kept your heart open to small miracles. Because you are one. And you always were. I sealed it, marked it, open at 88, and I placed it next to Marcus's letter, both tucked neatly beneath the bird cardigan in my drawer. Because I wanted to remember that sometimes, the greatest ally isn't someone else. Sometimes it's the moment you realize you never truly disappeared. You just stopped looking in the mirror. The first sign was the voicemail. I had just finished hanging laundry on the backyard line. A quiet pleasure I had returned to, even if the neighbors frowned at the sight of a brassiere catching the breeze. When I came back in, the little red light on the answering machine blinked once. It was my son. Hey Ma. I was just wondering if everything's okay. We haven't heard from you in a while. Let me know. He sounded tentative, like someone reaching into a drawer they hadn't opened in years and weren't sure what they'd find. I listened once, then pressed delete. Not to be cruel, but because I didn't owe anyone a performance of hurt just to be taken seriously. A few days later, my daughter stopped by unexpectedly. I saw her through the window, pacing on the porch, phone in hand, face drawn with something that looked like confusion. I didn't rush to answer. I let her knock twice before I opened the door. She blinked, surprised. "Hi, Mom," she said, like she hadn't quite expected me to look the same. I smiled gently. "Hello." She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the room like it had changed without her. It had. She looked at the fireplace, the new stack of library books, the fresh flowers in the vase that no longer held photographs. "Everything looks different," she said. I nodded. "It feels different too." She sat, not in her usual chair, the one she used to claim, but on the edge of the couch as if uncertain how much room she was allowed to take. We talked, lightly at first. Weather, library events, how the daffodils were already blooming. Then she looked at me. "Are you upset with us?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I thought about it. About the years. The forgetting. The beach photo. The silence that had once been mine and now seemed to sit between us. "No," I said softly. "I'm not upset. I'm just not waiting anymore." Her eyes welled, though no tears fell. "We didn't mean to." "I know," I interrupted, not unkindly. "But you did." She swallowed hard. "We thought you were okay with it. With everything." "I know," I said again. "That was my mistake." She nodded slowly. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a reckoning in the dramatic sense. But something shifted. In her. In me. Like a door creaked open just enough to let the light back in, but only if someone chose to step through. Over the next week, the calls came more frequently. Short messages. Uncertain tones. "Just checking in, Mom." "Hey, Ma. Wanted to see if you got the birthday card." Even the grandchildren, 2 of them at least, texted. Simple words but tentative. I didn't rush to reply. Because the point had never been to punish. It was to heal. And healing doesn't come when you pretend nothing happened. It comes when you stop chasing people who only ever notice you when you stop running. One morning I received an envelope in the mail, pale blue, hand-addressed. Inside was a card. No flowers, no glitter. Just a white background and 6 words written in my daughter-in-law's hand. "We didn't know. We're sorry." No name signed. No long explanation. Just the truth. I placed the card on my dresser beside Marcus's letter. Not as proof of victory, but as a sign. A small wave from a far-off boat, signaling that perhaps, someone was beginning to understand the island I had built for myself. But I didn't pack my bags. Didn't rush to rejoin the table. Instead, I stayed where I was, in my home, in my rhythm, in the warmth of friendships born in silence and letters written in crayon. I saw it in their voices now, the subtle edge of uncertainty, the recognition of distance they hadn't expected to feel, the kind of distance that settles in when someone stops orbiting your needs and builds her own sun. Once, a few weeks later, my son asked over the phone, "So, are you really not leaving the house to us?" It wasn't cruel. Just bewildered. I sipped my tea and said gently, "I'm leaving it to who saw its worth while I was still in it." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I didn't think it mattered to you." "I know," I said. "That's what mattered most." The consequences weren't loud. There were no grand arguments. No begging at the doorstep. But slowly I watched the weight of their absence return. Not to me but to them. Because when someone always waits for you, You forget they have a door of their own. And once that door closes, even quietly, the silence it leaves behind speaks louder than any words ever could. It happened on a Sunday. The sky was heavy with spring, the kind that makes everything feel like it's about to change. Not loudly, but with a quiet press of air that makes your lungs feel just a bit too full. I had just finished watering the front garden. The lilies were starting to bloom again, leaning toward the sun the way I had started leaning toward myself. That's when I saw their car. My daughter's first, then my son's, both pulling up without warning, one behind the other like they'd planned it. The doors opened in practiced unison. They stepped out with careful faces, the kind people wear when they're unsure if they're entering a home or a courtroom. My youngest trailed behind, the one who rarely called, whose eyes darted the most. She was holding a pie. Store-bought. Still in the tin. It wasn't Thanksgiving. It wasn't anyone's birthday. It was just Sunday. I opened the door before they could knock. "Hi, Mom," my daughter said, almost as if she were testing the word. I stepped aside. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just open. They shuffled into the living room, where the furniture had been rearranged. Not drastically, just enough that nothing felt quite where they remembered it. I had moved the couch. I had moved myself. We sat. They waited. And I let the silence grow roots. Finally my son spoke. "Ma, we wanted to talk. About everything." I nodded. "Then talk." There was a long pause. Then a deep breath. "We think we maybe didn't realize how far things had gone. How far we'd let you drift. Drift. As if I were the one who had floated off, untethered by choice." My youngest cleared her throat. "You were always so strong. We thought. Maybe you didn't mind." A strength. The illusion they had clung to when it suited them. The excuse they had used not to call, not to check, not to ask if I was still hoping for a seat at the table. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at them, not as my children but as people. Just people. "You thought I didn't mind being forgotten?" I asked softly. They didn't answer. "You thought that just because I didn't knock on your doors, I had nothing left to say?" Still silence. I took a breath. "I have been many things in this life," I said. "I have been a wife, a mother, a grandmother. I have stitched Halloween costumes at midnight, stayed up through fevers, and made meals no one remembered the next day. I have listened more than I should have and spoken less than I needed to. I gave you everything I had, sometimes more than I had to give." Their eyes lowered. My son rubbed the back of his neck. "And when I got quiet," I continued, "you thought that meant I was fine. But silence isn't always peace. Sometimes, it's the sound of someone waiting to be asked what they need." My daughter looked up then, tears gathering but not falling. "We didn't know how to fix it," she said. "I wasn't asking you to fix it," I replied. "I was asking you to see it." I stood slowly, walked to the hallway, and returned with a small envelope. I placed it on the table in front of them. Inside was a photocopy of the new deed. My name. My choice. They looked at it, not shocked but subdued, as if part of them had suspected. My son finally said, "So it's true then?" I nodded. "Yes. I'm leaving the house to the literacy center. They'll turn it into something living, something that grows." "But it's our family home," he said, voice tight. "No," I replied gently. "It was our family home. But a home isn't just walls and roof. It's where people gather in truth, in love, in remembrance. And when those things stopped showing up, so did the meaning." My youngest looked stricken. "We didn't mean to erase you." "I know," I said. "But meaning doesn't always come with intent. Sometimes it comes with presence. Or the lack of it." They sat with that, each word landing like a soft but undeniable weight. After a while, I walked to the cabinet and took out the folding chair. The same one they'd left on the porch all those months ago. I set it down beside the couch. "This was always my seat," I said. "And now I don't need it anymore. I bought the house. I sold the chairs. No shouting. No revenge. Just truth. And if you want a place in my life," I added, "you'll have to come as people. Not as children who expect me to wait with open arms and closed needs." They were quiet. But this time the silence didn't ache. It just sat with us, honest, unafraid. After a moment, my daughter placed the store-bought pie on the table. I know it's not the same, she said. I nodded. It doesn't have to be. And for the first time in a long while we shared a piece of something, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. A different kind of table. Not inherited. Chosen. The air that evening was softer somehow. After they left, my children, my echoes, I stood at the door for a while, watching their cars pull away like slow ships drifting back to sea. There was no final wave, no dramatic farewell. Just quiet. And in that quiet I felt something new. Not loneliness. Not triumph. Just peace. The kind that comes when you've said everything that needed saying, and none of it had to be shouted to count. I closed the door behind me gently, and walked through my house, barefoot on the wooden floor that still creaked in the places only I remembered. The kitchen light glowed warm. The laundry basket sat half full, waiting with no urgency. The teacup I'd left out earlier still rested beside the sink. It was just me now. Me and the life I had finally decided was worth being lived on purpose. That week I went back to the reading circle. Mateo ran to me waving a wrinkled spelling test, big red as circled at the top. I spelled trouble right, he said, beaming. I laughed, really laughed, and gave him the butterscotch I'd tucked in my cardigan pocket. He unwrapped it carefully like a treasure and whispered, "You're the reason I like Thursdays." I wanted to tell him he was the reason I liked mornings again, but I let the moment sit just as it was. Whole. After the session, I stayed behind to help put away chairs. One of the other volunteers, a younger woman, maybe mid-30s, smiled at me and said, "You're here every week. We're lucky to have you." Lucky. It had been so long since I'd felt like a gift. I walked home under a sky smeared with lavender, my shadow long and quiet beside me. Inside, the house was waiting. Not empty, just spacious. I lit a candle. Not for a holiday. Not for remembrance. Just for light. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the back door, stepped onto the porch and sat. No folding chair. Just the old wooden rocker I had almost thrown out but couldn't quite part with. I had repainted it deep green last month. It matched the trees that lined the far side of the yard. The ones I'd planted when my youngest was born. They were tall now. Unbothered. Rooted. Like me. Birds chirped overhead. Wind passed through the screen door like a visitor who didn't need to be fed or fixed or waited on. And as I rocked slowly, the breeze lifting strands of silver from my forehead, I realized something I hadn't understood until that moment. They could still come back. My children. They could still call. Still ask. Still remember. And maybe one day they would. But they would not find me in the same chair they left me in. Not waiting. Not small. Not quiet in the way I used to be. They would find someone who no longer needed the seat at their table, because she had built her own. In time they might sit with me here. Not out of obligation, but because they, too, had learned how to choose. But if they didn't, if they never did, I would still be here. Rocking. Rooted. Real. I began to write more. Not letters, not anymore, just pages of thoughts, poems, bits of memories. I started keeping a journal on the table near the door. I called it the Book of Staying. Because that's what I had done. I had stayed. When others moved on, when they forgot, when they grew up and grew away, I had stayed. And now I had finally stayed for myself. Elsie and I began a new tradition. Friday morning coffee at my place. We took turns bringing pastries, sat in the sunroom, and read aloud from our journals. She called it listening out loud. We didn't critique. We didn't interrupt. We just heard each other. Some days we didn't read at all. We just sat. Because presence, real presence, doesn't need filling. And then one day, she brought a little sign she'd made. She'd painted it herself, shaky cursive on a wooden board. Here, there is always room. If you come with kindness. We hung it by the door. The next week, one of the library children asked if she could read a story she had written. We said yes. The week after that, 2 more came. Then a neighbor. Then a cousin of a neighbor. And just like that, without ceremony, the house began to fill again. Not with the noise of obligation, but with the softness of people who chose to show up. The table I once sat at alone was now used for storytelling, for crafts, for shared cups of tea. Not always full, but always open. And one afternoon, I looked around the room, at the mismatched mugs, the folded paper cranes, the way sunlight stretched across the floor like an old friend, and I smiled. Not because everything had healed, but because I had. The door was still open to my family, but the house was no longer theirs to define. It was mine, and in it lived a woman who no longer asked to be seated. She simply stood up, built something beautiful, and let the world come to her, if it dared to be gentle. The days pass a little slower, but I don't mind. Slowness has a sweetness to it, the kind you miss when you're always rushing to be needed. These days I wake up with the sun brushing through my curtains, and not a single person expecting anything from me. And somehow that has become its own kind of belonging. I still walk to the library, still water my lilies, still sit on the porch and listen to the wind tell stories I forgot I knew. Sometimes my children call. Sometimes they don't. And that's all right, because I no longer measure my worth by who remembers me. I measure it by how I remember myself. The folding chair is long gone. So is the ache that came with it. And in its place, a table I built with my own hands. One where the seats are never begged for, never earned through silence, never stolen by neglect. Here we don't wait to be invited. We invite ourselves. We sit. We stay. We speak. And we do not shrink to fit. There's a peace in that, in knowing I am enough, even when I am alone. Especially when I am alone. If you've listened this far, maybe you've felt it too. That quiet ache of being overlooked in a life you helped build. And if you have, let me say this to you. You don't need their permission to matter. You don't need their table to be fed. You are not forgotten. Not by the world. And not by yourself. You are still here. Still becoming. Still worthy of a room, a seat, a story. And if no one's told you lately, I see you. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments.